So today we're going to talk about mastering. Now, this is a mixing channel, but mastering is obviously related. You use basically the same skills, you're just using them in a different way and in a different area on the whole mix rather than just individual elements. And to an extent, you know, when you're doing mixing on buses, so groups of instruments, guitars and whatnot, you know, you're getting further out towards the mastering side of things as it is. So you can consider to an extent mastering as an extension of mixing. The problem with mastering is that in ye olden days, when people and the recording industry had money before piracy and then streaming basically wiped it out, and now we don't have a music industry, but that's another topic for another day. Before all of that happened, you know, you would have the recording engineer, and you would have the producer, and you would have the mix engineer, and you would have the mastering engineer, and nowadays all of those people are you. It's just you doing all of that stuff, and there's no way that you can do it as well as all of those people who got really specialized at it, you know? So mastering at the end of the day is meant to be taking an end mix and then putting it in a different environment, a very carefully calibrated environment where you're kind of set up to hear very small things and adjust them in very small ways, and basically tweak everything so that it sounds great on not just one stereo but a whole bunch of different stereos. It's partially, you know, a second set of ears against your own in your own recording studio, and it's partially just doing additional things with additional gear that perhaps the mix engineer didn't have. Maybe the mix engineer didn't have some nice tape gear or some nice outboard analog compressors or whatever. And I would still recommend nowadays that, you know, if you have the money and you have the money to throw away essentially, that you send stuff out to an external mastering engineer. Find a good one, obviously, not just some hack, but you know, listen to their samples, see what they do, and see whether you can do it better. And if you can't, then maybe give them a shot. That's presupposing that you have money to burn. If you don't have money to burn, because let's face it, most of us aren't going to make money out of our recorded music. We're going to put it out there, and it's going to sit there, and we'll get money in drips and drabs, and over time we may build up a small sum. But is that small sum going to be enough to compensate for the amount of money that you put into paying for mastering or for mixing? A lot of the time the answer is no. So you have to be kind of choosy about what you do, and it also depends on the level that you're at. If you've gotten a lot of exposure, if a lot of people already like you, then yeah, you can afford to spend that scratch and you'll get it back. But if you're like most people nowadays and you're doing mastering for yourself, then there's two things that I'd focus on in the first instance. First, I would stop worrying about loudening, and I've done a whole nother video on why loudness maximization is not terribly important. I would start with EQ and start with playing around on the EQ of your entire mix and see what is popping up, what is dropping down, and what you need to adjust in order for the mix as a whole to sound great. If there's particular things that are popping up, then perhaps you need to go back to the mix and adjust those individual instruments. If you're popping up 4K, for example, and you're finding the rest of the mix sounds really good, but the hi-hat is really sticking out, maybe you need to go back to the mix and drop that down. Or maybe you need to go back to the mix and increase the 4K on other instruments. I don't know. So that you have that balance in the mix before you come to the mastering channel. Likewise, if you're pumping up the low end, you might find, oh, this sounds really good, but then it gets to a particular section in the song and it's just something is getting really overwhelming. The toms are really overpowering the mix because you bumped up that frequency. Well, go back to the mix, fix it there. Where you can, fix it in the mix. Mastering should really be about applying that final level of perfection and adjusting for multiple different stereos and multiple different speakers. Now, you yourself may not have multiple speakers, or you may not have different setups, but you can sure as hell take something and play it on headphones from your phone, or just play it on your phone, or play it on your friend's stereo, or play it in the car, that sort of thing. And that's all good. You may pick up on things in those different environments which are not how things should be. Or you find that you play it on your phone and all that you can hear is just the voice and nothing else, which is going to be the way a lot of the time, because that's the way phones are designed, right? Is to hear voice. So you don't really want to damage your mix to adjust for really crappy listening devices. So, you know, if you pick up on things on a smaller device, on, you know, just playing it through an iPhone speaker or something, and you go back to your actually decent, hopefully fairly flat monitors, and you find that adjusting that actually makes it sound worse, then in general, then you probably shouldn't make that change. But oftentimes I've taken stuff and I've put it on, you know, small computer speakers, for example. I've done a little bit of work for game mods and stuff, and playing stuff in there, you find that often things pop out in ways you didn't expect. And sometimes I'll go back and I'll adjust it in the main mix and I'll be like, oh, okay, that actually sounds a lot better. I just wasn't hearing it as clearly on these fabulous speakers because they sound fabulous. I needed to hear it on something crappy, you know. So that's a big part of it, is the EQ. One trick that you can do that a lot of different plugins allow you to do, including iZotope Ozone, is take a reference track and build yourself up a reference EQ based on it. I'm not going to go into details because it's going to be different for different plugins, but you can look it up for whatever plugin you've got. And then you can build up basically the average frequency response pattern for your own track. And then you, at least with iZotope Ozone, you can take your reference track and the EQ that you've built up from that and your own track, and you can basically shift some sliders around and adjust the EQ on your track so that it matches a little bit more of the EQ on the reference track. I find this is quite a useful technique, but it doesn't always help. Sometimes you do that and it just kind of pulls things out of balance, and often that's because your reference track just doesn't have the same kind of instruments, the same instrumentation, or just the same production as whatever you're working on. So it does help if your reference track is similar to your track, but it doesn't always work, right? Once you get onto things like compression and saturation and limiting and whatnot, it gets a little bit more complicated. I won't go over why you shouldn't be adjusting for loudness because I've already done that. But having said that, I often find that in the same way that when you apply compression to a bus for a given group of instruments, it is different from applying it to an individual track within that bus. For example, applying a bus compression to your guitar, all of your guitars at once, is different from applying it to the individual guitars, just because the way that they all meld together and the volumes and the way that different instruments dip out all the time and that sort of thing. In the same way that that is the case, applying bus compression to the entire mix also tends to be different and have a different quality and a different effect than applying it to individual instruments. So bus compression on the master does have its place. Again, if you can bring it down to individual instruments, then that can often work out better and you can get more separation between your instruments by doing it that way rather than doing it on the master bus. But still, sometimes you put it on the master bus and even with the best mix, it just makes it sound a little bit more punchy or something. You have to be careful that you don't overdo it, and you can hear it when you're overdoing it. You know, things start to just lack dynamics. There's no volume change going from the verse to the chorus or whatever. You start to lose a certain amount of the feeling in your track. You know, you start to lose a certain amount of the emotion in the track. If I'm adjusting things in the master and it takes away something from particularly the main, sort of like the lead instrument, if it takes something away from that was making me feel something, and I undo it. Because that's not what you're aiming for. It doesn't matter how great your track sounds, what matters is what it makes you feel at the end of the day. And in my initial mix philosophy video, I went over the interactions between those two things. Obviously, having a good sounding track works, but if it starts to interfere with the emotion, you've gone too far. And you have to be careful with mastering not to just sort of cut and paste the same settings from track to track, because that doesn't work. I'm not saying presets aren't useful. I've found them incredibly useful when mastering, largely because when you start with a blank slate, you're kind of just pulling stuff out of thin air to a certain extent. I mean, you're hearing stuff and you're adjusting it. But with mastering, when there's so many different components involved, EQ, compression, limiting, presets can be useful in the sense that it gives you clues as to where the track might go, how the song might sound if you go in a particular direction. So often I will put something in there. I'll start with a preset. I'll just flick between different presets. I'm like, oh, that sounds interesting, that sounds interesting. Oh, that one, that sounds really good, but the hi-hat is way too loud or whatever. And then I go back to the mix. But that's never the end of the story. That's only ever a starting point. Presets, especially for mastering, are only ever a starting point in your process. Once I've gotten something that I feel sounds right for the track and is bringing out the right kind of energy, then I start going in and turning things off and just seeing what happens. Okay, turn off the compression, turn off the limiting, turn off the EQ, turn off this and that, see what happens. Sometimes that thing was actually making it worse. And then I might go through and, okay, that still sounds good, let's just reduce it. Reduce the compression, reduce the EQ, reduce the limiting, whatever. Okay, does that sound better or worse? And it helps at this point a lot if you've got some kind of mastering plugins that have automated A-weighted volume matching. Then you're not just fooling yourself all the time, particularly when it comes to the volume-based side of things like compression and limiting. If you don't have something that's got A-weighted volume matching, then you have to make do. You have to, drag the slider and adjust the volume on your stereo at the same time or whatever, just so you know you're not fooling yourself about something sounding better when in fact it only sounds louder. And that's a really hard one to do. The other thing that I would caution is that, sometimes you might make things sound better, or you think you do, and then you bounce the track out, and then you normalize it, and then you compare it to something that you did earlier where you bounced it out and you normalized it. Sometimes you bounce this one out and you bounce this one out, and you find that, okay, this one sounded louder, but actually when you compare it and you like volume match them, you find that this one actually sounds better. So taking your tracks out, exporting them, normalizing them, and having multiple, exports to go back on can help in terms of not fooling yourself, because it's very easy to do a lot of work. There's particular confirmation bias, I can't remember what it's called, but the basic concept is because you've put a lot of work into something, clearly it must be important to continue on in the direction that you've gone in, and often in life that is not the case. And that's often the case with mixing, often the case with mastering. You get something sounding good and you think, oh, could really use some of this, or it really could go in this direction. You start doing that and you say, oh yeah, that sounds better, and you bounce it out and you do a little bit more, you did a little bit more, and a couple of hours later you've got like 7 different revisions. Next day you come back to it, listen to them all, and you're like, oh wow, that direction did not work at all. But subconsciously you're really going to hope that it did, right? That's why it's important to come back the next day when you're more objective, because you put all that work in, so you've got an incentive for it to have gone somewhere, even if it actually didn't. This becomes a lot more important in mastering. It's also important in mixing, but in mastering, obviously you're adjusting stuff in quite small amounts a lot of the time, and it becomes much easier to fool yourself when you're adjusting in small amounts. Now, let's talk a little bit about saturation and excitation and that sort of thing. I've gone into it in another video over excitation and saturation in the mix. In the master, the same sort of principles apply, and the same thing that I said earlier applies, which is, you know, if you're applying a lot of saturation or excitation at that point, and it's starting to sound good, you should maybe consider that maybe you should have applied that in the mix. That applies for most things. One of the mixing mastering engineers that I really admire, Steven Wilson, go check out his stuff, particularly his first solo album, what's it called, Insurgentes, or Insurgents, or however it's pronounced. He is sort of a very strong, not quite anti-loudness advocate, but he's big on audio quality, and his stuff, he doesn't really do a lot of stuff on the master bus. He tends to do it all in the mix, and his stuff sounds amazing. So, you know, it's just proof that you don't need to do all that heavy compression and limiting at the mastering side of things, but it can make things sound better. When you get too limiting, at that point, it becomes very much a crunch scenario, because, and there's a reason why you want to put it at the end. Partially because at that point, when you're increasing the volume of everything, you're also increasing the volume of all the less loud frequencies. So you're sort of pumping up lower volume frequencies that weren't as apparent, and that might start to sound a little bit better. Okay, that might be good, or it might be something that you want to go back to the mix and bring that up in the EQ instead, right? Or subtract it in the EQ in the mix, so that when you pump up the loudness in the master, those frequencies don't become so dominant, depending on what you're hearing, right? I find that a good mastering limiter will do stuff that a regular limiter won't do. It'll have a particular sound, a particular edge to it. It should be fairly customizable. You should be able to flick between different algorithms, because some things can sound really good on one mix, but not on another. I know some limiting algorithms have a tendency to sort of be quite mono in the way they do things, and other ones have a more separate stereo focus. So there's a lot of intricacy that goes into mastering limiters, I would say, more so than the compression side of things and the EQ side of things that I've seen. The main difference with mastering EQs, mastering compression and that sort of thing, it tends to be that they tend to be, when we're talking in the box here, and obviously we're talking mostly in the box, they tend to be calibrated towards higher average volume levels than mixing plugins for the most part. Possibly the second to last thing to talk about would be reverb and spatiality. So some mixing plugins, you have some kind of stereo widening, contracting aspect, where you can take a particular frequency range and you can expand or contract it in terms of the stereo spectrum. I've found as I've progressed with my mixing over the years, the need for me to do that has kind of gone away to a certain extent. Very occasionally I might use it a tiny weeny bit, but not by much, and seldom, if ever at all, nowadays, because that stuff should really happen in the mix, and it sounds much better when it happens in the mix, in my view. When you do it in the master, you often enter into phasing issues and just things just sounding not quite right. It's also a little bit dangerous, because in the mix you tend to get a really tight balance with your panning and your EQ and all of that sort of stuff, and you can sort of start to mess with that and mess with the balance and the emotion of that when you start to do stereo widening on frequencies bands in the mastering. Mastering reverb. So much like an earlier talk that I did where I talked about having a send for reverb and putting all the different instruments into that send and varying amounts of it just to give a little bit of glue to the mix and make all the instruments sound like they're in the same space. Similarly, having a reverb on the master can do a similar thing. It can sort of pull things together a little bit or just give a little bit of a slightly wider feel to the mix, something like that. But this is something where you have to be very delicate with it, and to be honest, I think you're overall better off doing this on the mixing side of things with a send bus, sending stuff over there from the different group channels of instruments. That way you've got a lot more control over it. And I think you probably get a better sound that way. Yeah, so I think that just about covers it. Gating, multiband gating can be useful for mastering. Sometimes you find that when you do that, it negates the kind of effect that you get from compression in general. So if you're just doing compression, then you're clamping down the louder frequencies and then you're raising the overall volume up, which means that these lower volume frequencies get pushed up a little bit. But if you've got some multiband gating happening in there, then that kind of counteracts that effect, and it means that those frequencies that are at a lower volume more or less stay at a lower volume. So that can counteract some of the problems that you can get with compression sort of messing with the EQ of the mix overall. And I would say in general multiband compression for mastering is probably preferred. There are some nice bus plugins, and sometimes it's nice to have them on the master, but generally with mastering you want a little bit more control over that aspect of it. Last thing I'm going to go into is analog modeling. Now, analog modeling is everywhere in plugins and that sort of thing nowadays, and it's getting better and better over time, and I particularly like some of the tape plugins that are out there. I like some of the Steve Slate stuff, their analog modeled compressors and whatnot. You can have too much of it. You can have too much of it and it starts to get a little bit peaky in the mix. It basically adds a bit too much excitation into the mix. Or if you're talking about tape and whatnot, it can add a bit too much mud. But the advantage of having it digital and having it faux analog is that you can just delete that instance of the plugin, and it's not something that's forever there in the mix that you can't get rid of. So if something's too much, you can dial it down. If you've got too much of a tape effect, you can get rid of it or you can dial it down. So the caution that I would have there is to not overload your mix with too much vibey kind of stuff, because you can end up getting a very unclear mix that's got a lot of harmonics and it just starts to sound a little bit peaky and unpleasant to listen to. But used in the right way, you can get stuff from that analog modeled stuff that you really can't get from just a straight, clean, purely digital EQ compressor, etc., etc. There's one that I particularly like that not a lot of people seem to use or know about, which is called VTMM2, I think is the name. And I forget the guy who makes it. It's incredibly high CPU usage, and I only ever use it on the master. But it's basically analog modeled tape compression, and it's just got a very particular sound to it that I can't get from the other tape things or this or that or the other. This isn't an advertisement for that product, although, personally I highly recommend it. What I'm trying to illustrate here is that with a lot of this analog model stuff, you can get stuff that's got a very particular sound that you can't get by combinations of other things, at least not in a very easy way. There's also some other plugins out there for analog modeled clipping and analog modeled limiting, and I would say most of the mastering stuff nowadays has at least some analog modeling stuff in it somewhere. That's about all I've got for mastering. It's probably the one thing that I like doing the most, because by that point, you know, all the hard stuff is out of the way and you're all downhill from there. At least if you've done your, you know, your decent work on your mix and you've really made things shine. There. Hope that helps.